Right, welcome. Thank you very much for coming. All right, my name is Alan Justad. I'm with the City of Seattle, Department of Planning and Development, and welcome to our meeting here. This is our 15th year of doing these public information meetings about landslide awareness, what you should know if you own property on hillsides, top of the bottom and mid-slope. And we feel like it's a great service to provide to the community. We'll just run through what we're going to have for a presentation. The way the meeting works, we'll have a general presentation on some of the main issues involved in managing slope property in the City of Seattle in terms of landslide mitigation. And then we'll have some question and answer, and then we'll have plenty of time for you to go to each of the tables around the room and talk to the professionals here one-on-one about any questions you might have for your own property. I'll do a little bit on regulation. Bill LaPrade with Shannon Wilson will talk about the geology, the types of landslides that we have, why we have landslides. He's a real expert in this and offers his time for these meetings. And then we'll have Laurel Harrington from Seattle Public Utilities, and she'll talk about what the city does for landslide mitigation on its own property, protecting utilities and roads and so forth. And then Mark Mead from Parks Department will talk about vegetation on slopes. And people tend to have a lot of questions about how to manage their trees on the slopes, how to change them out if you're going to. And so that's the general presentation. So, coming from the outside to provide information for you in the one-on-ones, we have the American Society of Civil Engineers. You want to raise your hand back there, far corner. These people are here as volunteers. They're not selling their services. They're providing you with their professional expertise. This Association of Engineering Geologists, I guess, is the, here, if you raise your hand there. Thank you. And then Associated Builders and Contractors in the back who do work on hillsides on a regular basis can talk to you about how they would approach a project. And then the International Society of Arboriculture. Please raise your hand. Again, the vegetation issue that people are very interested in. From the City of Seattle, we have Seattle Public Utilities. Laurel is representing them. They'll talk about the mitigation program, but also she can talk to you offline about various places around the city where SPU might be involved. Seattle Parks and Recreation. Mark is here from the Parks to talk about Mark Mead. And then Seattle Department of Transportation, Steve Howe. Steve, raise your hand. A lot of landslides affect roads, and how water is handled on the roads is very important on the hillsides. We can talk to you about specific situations. And then from the Department of Planning and Development, my department, Susan Chang is in charge of our geotechnical engineering, and she's an expert in how you might approach a project if you need to do work on a hillside. You know, one of the things about a hillside is that's one place where you don't just do it. You know, you got some energy, you got some time, let's just get that done. Let's cut that slope and put that yard in. You need to have a conversation first. You need to know professionally what that's going to do to that hillside and how you can manage it in the long term so that you don't have problems down the line. In 1997, 96, 97, the holiday storm is really what triggered these meetings, and also a lot of programs that the city did for landslide mitigation and also a landslide study. We had a lot of landslides. We had snow and then rain after it, and so the very fast melt that clogged the drains on the slopes. My department responded to 380 slides. There were probably many more that weren't reported, probably didn't need to be, but, and we red tagged 25 buildings, meaning you couldn't go back in them until either there were major repairs or at least an engineering report that told us that it was going to be okay the way it was. We had 99,100,000 that were yellow tagged, and in that case, we might have said, you can't use that backyard until you get an engineering report, or you can't stay overnight there. So it was bad enough that we had to tag those buildings. And the 185 green tags, they had damage. People could stay there, but they had called us because they did have damage out there. I remember one house slid actually off Beacon Hill right down onto something, it was 17th or 19th. Yeah, it was quite a sight to see to go out there. It was a hole just out of the middle of the street. So out of that came these meetings, among other things. So every year for the last 14 years, we've been having 2 public meetings, sometimes 3, one in the north, one in the south, to offer this information to you. I'm going to introduce Bill LaPrade now, and Shannon Wilson. He'll tell you a little more about why we have these landslides.
Hey, thanks, Alan. This morning, what I want to do is talk about what the geology in Seattle is and how it relates to landslides. There are several reasons for landslides in Seattle. Number one is topography. At the end of glaciation, about 16,000 years ago, we were left with steep topography that was in an unstable configuration. And of course, it's evolved over time. Slopes have regressed, but right now we're left with a lot of these steep slopes on our marine and inland topography. And they're in a steep configuration, and many are in an unstable configuration. We have geology that's left over from the glaciers and from several episodes of glaciation, and that is very complicated, and especially, and I'll show you a map after a while, a cross-section through a hillside, whenever you get pervious sediment over impervious sediment, you perch water, and water pops out, as you all know, in different places on your hillsides and causes problems. And then water. We don't have landslides without water. Every once in a while, many of us in this room respond to a landslide in the middle of the summer or in the fall. And we go out there and what's going on here? And it invariably is water. Something is broken, the water has gotten free from some kind of conveyance, and it's causing trouble. And of course, human activity. We all know that once you start to develop an area, especially if it's developed in an improper way or without a lot of prudence, you start to get additional landslides or an increase in the frequency of landslides. And going back, there have been 3 different studies now that all kind of come in about the same number. Back in the 70s, Don Tubbs wrote a PhD thesis, and he figured out that there about 74% of the landslides had some human impact. Derek Booth did an additional study for King County in the 80s and came up with about 80%. And then the Seattle landslide study that I was involved in, I came up with the same number again. So once you start to put people and their development together on steep slopes, and you mix water in with that, you start to get an increase in the frequency of landslides. So this is the slice through the hillside that I was telling you about. There is no typical Seattle hillside. They're all made up a little bit differently. South of the Seattle Fault, you get the core of many of the hillsides is made up of bedrock. In most cases, sandstone, siltstone. You get a little bit farther, you get into volcanic rocks. But north of the Seattle Fault, the inner core of most of these hillsides is made up of much older glacial and non-glacial deposits. And then around the outsides, kind of plastered on the outside of many of these hillsides, are the deposits from the last glaciation. That being the Lawton clay, which comes up to about elevation 160 in most places. And then you can see this tan color, which is the advanced outwash. That's the sands and gravels that are laid down throughout most of Seattle. And then covering much of Seattle is this till, and many people call it a hardpan. You know it when you see it. It looks a lot like concrete. It's gray, and water doesn't go through it very well. If you have it in your yard, it's hard to grow anything, right? So so you do get water coming through gaps in the till or cracks in the till, gets down into the sand and gravel, or in the older soils here, and it pops out in these places on the hillsides. And in many of the hillsides, you'll find that the springs are about the same elevation all the way along, and that's because of the elevation of those deposits on the hillside. Talking about water, this is from the Seattle landslide study, which was finished in 2000. And you can see this is rainfall over here, and this is the water year, July through June. So the winter months are right in here. So you can see it's buildup is a buildup. September, October builds up, and actually November is a really wet month. But if you look over here, here's November here, we don't really see any landslides, very few landslides in November. And that's because it takes time to build up that water table and saturate the soils on the hillsides. And you can see, so December is also wet, and then January it actually starts to tail off, but the largest, the month that has the most landslides is January. And most of these are kicked off by not only a high water table, but then being followed by a large storm. So there is a lag in the landslides after the rainfall. This gives you an idea of time-wise, starting back in the first record we have in the Seattle landslide study, and that's taken from the SDOT's landslide file, is from 1896. So you can see we start back here, and these low numbers back here, these are the number of landslides per year. A lot of this is probably, first of all, the population was low, and secondly, these are reported landslides. So there were no doubt landslides occurring, but they weren't being reported. And then here's the winter of 33, 34, when everything went awry in Seattle. Landslides all over town, and it was the reason that there was a big program. There was a WPA program in the 30s to fix landslides all around Seattle. There were 29 sites, and there were 25 projects built. Tunnels, deep drains, all hand-mined all throughout Seattle. And then there were years of more and less landslides, and then the winter of 85, 86, this is when a large storm came in and just sat. Many of these, over Seattle, many of these landslides in 85, 86 were in the Madrona area. They were in specific parts of town. Other parts of town, it rained a lot, but Madrona really got hammered that year. And so that was a really large deluge over a short period of time. And of course, the reason we're here today is because of this storm, what we call the holiday storm, because it was a rain-on-snow event. It had been a rainy year the year before, 95, 96. There were still a lot of landslides in 95, 96, followed by a lot of rain that fall of 96. And then it snowed around Christmas time. The snow was on the ground, and then a big storm came in. The Pineapple Express dumped a lot of rain, and that melted. And then starting January 1st, things started to move and continued to move for a long time. Continued right up until there was into March that year. Well, one of the spin-offs from the Seattle landslide study was this. They took, a scientist from the U.S. Geological Survey took the best of the data, the most detailed of the data, and did a study to find out what type of rainfall would trigger landslides. And in the end, what he came down to was and this is along the x-axis, it's the 15-day cumulative precipitation followed by a 3-day precipitation. Remember I told you you have to essentially fill up the voids in the soil, saturate the soil, and then it takes a big storm to start kicking things off. So this red line is the line that indicates when you're going to start having landslides. So on November, for instance, on November, I believe this is November 2nd, last week, it was pretty dry. We're probably over around in here someplace where my pointer is. And once it gets to that red line, then you know that landslides are probably going to start to occur in the Seattle area. It may not mean it's landslide on your property, but somewhere there are landslides starting to occur. And they have continued over the years to refine this based on updated information. And this website right across here, you can go on here, and this is updated daily, and it's on the back of your yellow sheet. And if you live on a steep hillside, I would recommend you put that on your favorites list, and every once in a while check it out. I do, all winter long, and I think many of the people around the outside of this room do the same. It's also used by the city and other people as a means for putting people on call for emergency response. So let me go through some of the types of landslides. This is the most uncommon. There are a few places around town, or very few, where large blocks of soil. We don't really have any rock bluffs in Seattle, but we do have some soil bluffs that periodically large chunks fall off. It acts almost like a rock. But again, very, very few of these occurring in Seattle. This is a deep-seated landslide where you have clay down below and sand overlying. Might have a till cap up here, but the landslide occurs by setting down from up above, and down on, and it's on top of the bottom of the slide is at the top of the clay. This is similar to what has happened out on Alki, for instance, in the area where all the condominiums are along Alki. This is typical, where there's a large set down up the top. And that slide was fixed by putting in a deep drain along this contact that picks up the water here, and also by putting in drains back into the hillside to pick up the water back inside the hill. These are not particularly dangerous because most of them, not all of them, but most of these occur slowly, where they set down slowly up above and push out and bulge out at the bottom. These are uncommon, but they can be disastrous. If any of you remember the Woodway slide back in '97, this is what happened up there, is the soil failed down through the sand and down through the clay, and in one disastrous big whoomp, the whole thing went down across the tracks, pushed the train out into the Puget Sound. And these occur around Puget Sound on a very infrequent basis, but these can be disastrous because the ones that have happened, we know have happened very quickly. The most common are these kinds of landslides. You have, on all the hillsides around Seattle, we have this layer, geologists call it colluvium, some people call it slope wash or landslide debris, whatever. It's about 3 to 10 feet thick on all the hillsides, and it's the accumulation of soil that's been loosened by previous landslides, and also been loosened by trees, roots penetrating, freeze and thaw, and then soil that's come from up here and been washed down here, and it's loose, and when it gets water, it takes up water, it also loses strength. So it can flow, and so on many of these steep hillsides, once it gets going, it not only takes the earth, but what can be even more destructive, it takes the trees along with it, and sometimes the trees cause more damage than the mud itself. Another part of the follow-up to the Seattle landslide study was a redo of the landslide-prone areas. Alan will explain to you later, or maybe Susan will explain to you later about the different kinds of regulated steep slopes. But one of them are areas that have the correct geology. In other words, the sand over clay or sand over rock, and they have water associated with them, and in many cases a bowl-like or amphitheater-like topography. So after we did the Seattle landslide study, and looked at concentrations of landslides combined with topography, we made recommendations to the city, and this map shows areas where the landslide-prone areas were changed from the previous ones that had been used by DPD. And this kind of goes along with what I told you previously. 68% of the landslides are those shallow colluvial slides. And these others make up smaller. Here's the deep-seated slides, the high bluff peel-off, groundwater blowout. The ones that cause the most damage and are the most frequent are these shallow slides. And with that, I'll turn it over to Laura.
Thank you. As noticed here, I'm Laurel Harrington, Seattle Public Utilities, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the landslide program for the city. And with that, let's see, I guess I have to use this. All right, so as you already heard, the city's landslide program kind of came about because of the massive widespread slides we had in 1996, 1997. And as a result, the various city departments got together and sort of jointly said, yes, we need our programs in each major department. For example, Seattle Department of Transportation, the Parks Department, and Seattle Public Utilities all have their own programs with support from some of the other departments. And essentially, we have put together what we call capital improvement programs, meaning that we go out and get bond money for doing them to try to protect our utilities facilities so that we're not down the road losing a pump station for Seattle Department of Transportation, not losing the road, any of the major facilities that are needed for a functioning city. There are some kind of typical kinds of solutions that we need in order to protect against landslides and try to prevent them from happening in the future. One of them, as you heard, was actually to do the landslide study that determined, you can see on these maps, where commonly we've had landslides in the past and where we'd like to mitigate them. One of the things we already heard from Bill was surface water. If we have a lot of surface water running down a slope, uncontrolled, much more likely to saturate, much more likely to trigger a slide. So you want to control that. Groundwater is sometimes an issue. Bill talked about at a certain down the layer where you see those springs coming out on the hillside. That's groundwater, and again, some control of that can help from actually preventing a landslide. And then the third one is the more drastic solutions when you actually put in retaining walls, and you might terrace back the slope so you get those steps to reduce the steepness of the grade. So as part of Seattle Public Utilities and some of the other departments here, we kind of use all of those techniques, kind of depending, and there's techniques that you in your own ways can kind of think about using. One very simple way, and again is one that you could utilize, but you do need to be careful about it. And that is, it's a little hard to see in this picture. Before you can see all this drainage, this is a steep hillside over here. This is in West Seattle, Southwest Jacobson, the road kind of lines steeply down. There's sort of uncontrolled water coming off here, and so what we did was, there is a drainage system, but it's clearly not getting to it. So they put a simple asphalt berm here, and then they had an inlet farther down that kind of guided the water away from the steep slope into the inlet. And again, that's something you could do, but you need to think about where you're guiding the water to. Are you just guiding it to your next door neighbor? Are you guiding it down to somebody else's slope? Or are you actually guiding it to a drainage system that would take it away? So you need to think about that when you do it. Here's another kind of solution. This was actually Queen Anne Hill. And probably a little hard to see here, we had a street end. And we have these two in West Seattle where they end because down there's an extremely steep slope. This was actually in I think it was close to our 100-year, where we're getting like 100-year levels of rain, if you recall those very, very heavy rains that we had back then. And essentially this whole concrete wall just slid away. So when we looked carefully at it, we realized it was actually drainage coming down the street, jumping the curb and causing the problem. So what we did is we put some additional inlets, trying to catch that water, put it in the drainage system before it hit the slope. On this one, you have sort of you can see a lot of water coming down that very, very steep slope, taking a lot of the vegetation with it, definitely cleared it out. And in this case, because it was a place where there wasn't a drainage system, we really needed to bring the water down to the bottom of the slope. What we ended up doing was putting in a HDPE pipe, one of those, they look kind of like accordion pipes, heavy in this case because it's taking quite a bit of drainage, pretty big, pinned to the slope because it wasn't really possible to bury it in the slope. And then at the bottom we connect properly into an actual drainage system. So again, a lot in landslides, especially since Seattle Public Utilities trying to take care of drainage, is to try to handle the drainage. Most of these projects, again, were to try to protect various of our own facilities, meaning the roads, Parks Department land, or our own drainage system. This is sort of a simple kind of subsurface drain that you could do to try to catch not necessarily surface water, but more water that's coming a little bit deeper. And essentially you're basically digging a trench, you're filling it with, putting filter fabric around it so you don't get material sloughing into it, soil sloughing into it. You have a perforated drain pipe here, and as you can see here, you have the seepage coming in, and then the pipe can carry it away. And some of the places where this might be used is just above a steep slope, where you try to prevent that water from getting down the steep slope. You do what's called a cutoff drain. You try to cut off that water. Again, once you get it into the trench, you need to slope the trench and have it go to a place where it can be safely taken away. Another place which you can commonly use this is if there's a slope and here's your house and maybe a garage or a basement, you can use that same kind of thing to go across the front to try to keep that water from getting into your basement. And again, eventually you've got to route that water and you need to route it safely away. This is a case, and this one unfortunately is very hard to see, where we actually, all this fresh stuff is actually a trench drain, and as you can see it was at the end, that pipe in that trench was eventually put into a manhole and into an inlet into the drainage system. Here's sort of one that's specific to, we do it other places, but this particular job was in West Seattle, above Alki Avenue Southwest, in that big parkland, Parks Department land above the condos in Alki Avenue Southwest. And what they essentially did is we put in two different arrays of pipes going back into the ground, and they're called horizontal drains because the water kind of comes out horizontally. Sorry, you got a question?
Do you think you could turn off some of the lights so we can get better detail?
Okay, sure. Yeah, that's a good idea. I'm not quite sure how it's going to affect your video camera. It's okay?
Okay.
Okay, yeah. Thanks. Thanks for speaking up. Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Is that better?
Yes.
All right. Okay, so here you can see these horizontal drains going back into the hillside. They have outlets here, and they actually go into a pipe, again, that safely carries the water away. And on that particular site above Alki Avenue Southwest, there's actually two arrays like this that are going back and catching groundwater. In this particular case, it was to protect Parks Department land that was there. Also, it partially protected some of the condos down below on that hillside. This is getting more into the large structural projects. You know, obviously these, if you're going to do it in your own private homes, you probably need to get some kind of geotechnical engineer. You might have to get a contractor out there to actually do the work. For protecting roadways in very steep-sided slopes, these are some of the things that we can use. You can see here there was what we call subsidence, which the soil underneath the downhill side starts to slip away, the road starts to dip. You might actually observe this in your own yards. If you have concrete, it's something that you might yourself want to see if you're starting to get cracking and starting to get dipping of your either the ground or your concrete, meaning soil is getting eaten away underneath. And so in this case, as you can see, they put up a whole what we call soldier pile wall, which is the uprights, and then you have some horizontal members to keep the soil back. And here's another site, again, an extremely steep hillside. You can see it has sort of the surface slide where all the vegetation and soil is starting to slip away with a possibility of undermining the road. This was after the fix was done, where you have these walls that essentially were put in to stabilize that hillside. These kinds of fixes tend to be very, very expensive, much more expensive than if diverting water from the slope. So that's kind of the variety of kinds of projects that the city has done to protect their facilities. We, as a utility and department, similarly have operation and maintenance that's done. And one of the things that we do specifically in Seattle Public Utilities, because the drainage systems are under us for the city, is that we have certain inlets, those grates in the street that you see. There are certain ones that have been designated as critical because if they plugged, we might overflow onto a slope. It might cause a lot of flooding in the street. And so those, before the storm season hits, we try to go out, clean them out, make sure they're in good condition. And then if a storm does hit, we try to, as much as possible, to get out and see if those are plugging or being a problem. I've actually forgotten how many thousands and thousands and thousands of inlets we have, but it's pretty mind-boggling. And so one of the things that we've been trying to get out there is our adopted drain program. And you don't have to be a part of the adopted drain program to just go out in your own street, especially if you're living either below a steep slope or on a steep slope, to just try to make sure that the leaves and debris in the street are cleaned away from those drains. They help other people, they help yourselves, and they definitely help the city, because at any instant in time, especially if you have a big windstorm and all the leaves dump at once, it's not possible to get to all those drains. So it's a plea for your sakes and our sakes, if you can adopt a drain and you don't need to do it officially, you can just go out there and do it. We do have staff that's on call 24/7. Seattle Department of Transportation also does. DPD has a geotechnical engineer, building person actually on call 24/7 also. So that if we need to, we can respond to a slide. If it's covering a road, it's taken out some of our drainage or water utilities, we can get somebody out there right away. And geotechnical engineer staff under myself, if called on, will also go out and look as long as it's in daylight hours. So, as we say, that's great, but what happens if a slide occurs? First off, if either you yourself are in a house, or you see a neighbor's house, or you see a road that you feel like threatened, and it's immediate danger of possible life, call 911. All you need to do, the police will get out there, they can shut the road off, or they can tell people, sorry, you cannot go in your house, it's unsafe. So never be shy about calling 911 if it's a life safety issue. If it's an issue in which, yeah, there seems to be a slide, you see, oh, it's debris, you're kind of wondering, has it really caused a problem? Maybe it's slightly blocking a road. Then on the back of your sheet, there are specific numbers to call. So If you're walking through the park and you notice, oh gosh, there's a slide that's come down, there's a number you can call for the Parks Department. If you see the road is blocked, there's one for the Seattle Department of Transportation, SDOT. If it's like, oh, it's too much, just call one of them and they'll take care of it. Well, we do talk to each other, we talk to each other a lot. But if you can manage to call directly the right one, that's very helpful to us too. So with that, I'm going to pass over the baton to Mark Mead of Parks.
Hi, how are you today? I'm the forester for Seattle Parks, and the reason that I'm talking to you is that I'm a forester, but also we manage, Seattle Parks manages about 2,500 acres of land in the city that's forested, and majority of that is on the steep slopes. Well, if you took a look at the West Seattle area, the red areas that are circled around it, in West Seattle, we own most of those steep bluffs, so Alki, all the way around West Wamish, the Wamish Greenbelt, and down to Ceola. We own a lot of that. Jacobson Road, a lot of the places that you saw in the previous slides were properties that adjacent to ours. So we have people up above us that are concerned about issues with vegetation, and we have people down below who are concerned about issues with vegetation having to do with whether or not the trees are making the slope stable or whether or not they can maintain their view. So one of the biggest issues that we deal with is taking a look at a tree, and so one of the things that I do with people if we want to start talking about slopes, and as Bill was talking about earlier, that some of these slopes, these sloughing slides are pretty slow. And so an indication of sliding can be seen in, through the trees. Is if you take a look, most trees want to go perpendicular to vertical. They want to go perpendicular to the gravity. So on a steep slope, they're going to be pointing straight up. And they'll have to do that on steep slopes. They may have to do what we call pistol butting, which is bending. The more bending you see at the bottom there tells you if that slope has been moving. And that can give you an indication that the slope has been in a slope creep or not. But the other thing that's really important to understand too is that if you take a look at this, how this tree is going up and down, is that right here at this point you can see that the slope occurred, or the slide occurred probably 15 years ago. And this is probably, these are alders, and so they responded to that slope, and then they grew up, straight up. And so this is what we're trying to look at, is how are the trees standing, and that if you look at mostly conifer trees, they have, their tips are going to be usually pointed straight to the sky. And if you see a conifer tree on a slope that's pointing down at the very tip, then that's an indication that you need to get somebody out there really quick and take a look at this, because the slope is moving, and it's probably moving pretty quick. The reason that we talk about this a lot is because the fact of the matter is that it's a hit and miss, or a balance act between trees on slopes and whether or not they cause slides or whether or not they stop slides. And the big issue is the water. And as we heard here today, most of the issues have to do with water. More water than the slope can hold. The trees are going to help out with some of the water retention because they will, their roots down here at the bottom are going to get into that slough slide material, and they're going to actually act as a webbing. And what they're going to do is they're going to try to, they'll suck water out of the slope. They'll also intercept water. Their leaves and branches will intercept water, and it'll hit in the rain, and it will hit those branches and leaves, and then it'll evaporate. So we have that kind of water going out, and then over these long periods, unfortunately for us in the Pacific Northwest, our rain cycle is different than everybody else's in most of America, in the sense that our rains come in the fall and the winter, when the major trees that we have growing on these steep slopes, because we logged them all, as Bill mentioned earlier, that most of the slopes were managed a long time ago, this human intervention that he was talking about. What we're seeing is this regrowth of big leaf maple and alder on these steep slopes. That big leaf maple and alder are deciduous trees, and they lose their leaves during the fall, so that reduces the amount of water that they can intercept. They're also not active during that fall season, meaning that they're not actively sucking water up out of the ground. Conifer trees, which are the native successional tree, or the last part. Does everybody know successional? The term successional from high school? No? Okay. what happens in the natural forest and the native forest is that there will be a succession of trees that come in based upon the conditions of the site. And in Pacific Northwest, it's usually alder, big leaf maple, Douglas fir, cedar, hemlock, and in some places grand fir, in that order. And it takes about somewhere between 1,200 years to 1,500 years to go through that cycle, because each of those trees is going to be on that site for about 150, 200, 300, and we get into Douglas fir about 500 years. So when we log these slopes, what happened is we changed the conditions here, and these deciduous trees start to grow in here, and the root systems are fairly good at holding on to the soils. But if we see a slope, and this is what I was seeing when I first got here, is that if I see a slope with alder on it, and particularly young alder, that slope is recently slid. And if I see a slope that looks a lot like this, where we have this leaning trees, and we have some sloughing down below, and most of this time you're going to see it's going to be alder. What we were seeing is that actually there's some species-specific response to sliding. And what it is that usually on a slope that's fairly active, moves fairly often, it's going to be alder. And the alder is going to be leaning, and if it's been leaning, that means it's going to, there's some potential for slide. If we see big leaf maple on the slope, it means that slope's a little bit more stable and it's been around for a little bit longer. And those big leaf maple, and like you can see here, this one right here is probably about, this is out at Carkeek Park, right above the big slide that occurred out there that pushed on the railroad tracks. This maple is probably about 60 years old. So it's been sitting on the top of that slope for that long. The idea for us in terms of when we take a look at this, and we have like Burkilman Trail, that's every year Burkilman Trail, I don't know if you've ever been out there on the Burkilman Trail, there's always something going on out there on the Burkilman Trail, and we get a lot of slides on it. This is side by side. This little slide that occurred, this little sloughing that occurred right here, had no vegetation on it to speak of, and it had a little bit of alder on it. This slope, this area right here is right next to it, literally 2 steps over from it, and it's got big leaf maple holding onto that slope, the same type of site, same type of slope. So when we start talking about managing 4 different things, and one of the things that I get a lot of calls about, I would say about a third of phone calls that I get in any given day are about view. People want their view because we manage the slope areas, we manage the big areas that are directly below people's homes, and they're concerned about their views. We get a lot of questions about view management. And so one of the things that we talk about is that we want to retain trees on these slopes. And actually some of the DPD's rules, you do have to manage trees according to, if it's your property, according to their rules. And those rules include retaining as much canopy as we can on the slopes, because the canopy does intercept water, and that it actually does slow down some of the problems that we see with sloughing and sliding to a minor extent. It's not going to stop the slide, but the reality is that we're still kind of up in the air between, it's still a bubble, like Carpenter's level, in terms of whether or not trees contribute to a slide or trees are stopping the slide, because it's really not that accurate of a science right now. The issues that you see though is that one of the things that we look at is that when we try to look at managing for our thick trees, these big leaf maples and alders that have come back up, is we start looking at trying to take out individual trees and creating these corridors that people can see through and still maintain some of the canopy up above, most of the canopy up above, because those root systems are really important. The other way that you can manage for this is to, as you go through your planting project for your vegetation, is that you want to keep as much vegetation as you can on the slope. And what you do is instead, you start to select out trees that are going to be of shorter size. And you gradually ramp them up. And so you look at the initial or the final height of the tree, and all your guys will tell you how high this tree can get, or brush or shrub that you're going to put up there. As an example, a really good hedge slope that doesn't get vegetation is kinnikinnick, but it takes a long time for it to grow. It's a native, but it only gets about 3 to 5 feet tall if you're really lucky. So if you want to put a nice little bluff right at or a nice little hedge right at the very top, that would be a good choice. The other thing is that you want to keep these areas in smaller growing trees, and some of the smaller growing trees in our area are the native Snowberry, it's a good planting. And there's a listing, if you look at the back of this yellow sheet, there's at the very bottom of the sheet, you'll see that there's a website with 3 different publications about managing vegetation on steep slopes. Those 3 documents, if you're going to be looking at doing some management of your areas, I would recommend that you pull those 3 documents, download those 3 documents. They've been around for quite a while. They have all the information that you're going to need for this, to do this kind of work. And then working with a geotech and working with an arborist to come up with that plan will help address most of the issues that you're going to have. Now, one of the things that we want to talk about, and because this is what I do quite a bit of, is that we have invasive non-native plants growing on slopes, and primarily blackberry and ivy on the slopes that provide that low-growing vegetation. They're not as deeply rooted as the native species, and so what we're doing in our properties is we're trying to, for most places where we can, we're trying to change that out through a volunteer program called the Green Seattle Partnership. And the Green Seattle Partnership works with citizen volunteers to remove ivy and blackberry, but not on these steep slopes. We actually have a mitigation program where we go through with some of our paid contractors to do this work. And what we'll do is, and our staff, and what we'll do is we'll put in the same type of materials in the like that you'll see in the back of those books, or in those books. We'll put in straw wattles, we'll put in, which are just basically big batting that goes down on the ground. We'll plant with natives, and we'll try to get the site back to a more native-like condition in a lot faster. You'll notice right here that we have planted, this is a cedar tree, I think it's cedar tree, probably hemlocks, and then here we put in some sword fern, native sword fern, and you can see these little flashes here as leftovers from the ivy that need to get out of there. But we pulled, this slope was completely covered with ivy, and what we did was pull all the ivy off and rolled it off, and then planted with the native species. So if you're looking for any questions about vegetation and about steep slopes, one of the things you want to do too is when you're looking about is contact us at Seattle Parks in terms of the types of work that we do is always on Parks property. If you're interested in a view arrangement, looking for doing some view pruning or view trimming on our property, contact me and we will work with you on a permit for doing that work. So now we have Alan.
What's your name?
Mark me.
Mark, me?
Me.
Thanks, Mark. Just real quickly, I'm going to talk about the regulations that DPD administers for private property that you're doing work on. And I want to reiterate what Bill LaPrada said. On the map behind Susan here, we have the 3 types of landslide prone areas that under the Environmental Critical Areas Ordinance, we have special regulations on how to do work on those, whether it's retaining wall, an addition to your house, landscaping with rockeries of a certain size. All of those need to be looked at by our geotech engineers. And we're looking at stability and water management in terms of how you're going to handle that. The 3 types, again, are the known landslide areas. We have many of them because we have good records here. And certainly there we want to see you address the issues in terms of the proper engineering that's needed. Then we have the potential landslide areas, and that's what Bill was talking about, where you've got the kind of soil where it doesn't have to be as steep for it to still be a slippery situation. And then we've got the steep slopes, 40%. And so the rules are a little complex, and the permits do take longer, but there's a good reason for that. Susan's people need to see competent engineering report and engineering proposal if you're doing any major work on a hillside, and before they can sign off on it. And they also need, working with the drainage folks, to see that the water is properly being handled as well. We also have the stormwater and grading ordinance, and that would actually, and the stormwater and grading, we split those. Those are now 2 separate ordinances. Both of those also apply, the stormwater ordinance and the grading ordinance, in terms of properly handling those materials on the slope. Again, you'll probably end up needing a professional for any major work, certainly, and it doesn't take much on a steep hillside for us to require the kind of competence that really comes from a professional in the field. We'll look at what you have, whatever you develop first, but it's very likely we're going to need something stamped off depending on what you're proposing. And so the permits do take longer, but we do have a special team to work on those, and we're quite aware of what people need to be doing, and we're very eager to work with you on that. And one last thing, again, I think Mark mentioned that. If you're removing trees on a steep hillside, that's not allowed directly unless there are some special circumstances around why you're doing that. And you do need to talk to my department about that as well. Our phone number's on the back. And so I know the permitting part's not the exciting part, but it does provide, if you think about it, some good management uphill from you and downhill from you throughout your hill slope. You have a vertical neighborhood, you're working together whether you know it or not, and so the regulations are there to try to set a minimum standard for properly protecting what's going on there. With that, I think Bill's got his favorite do's and don'ts list, as we all like.
Okay, thanks, Alan. You all have this list, or if you didn't, you should pick it up. It's the do's and don'ts list. And let's run through it quickly. First, the don't list. Don't direct storm and other water onto a slope. That kind of follows a theme that you've been hearing this morning. Because that'll saturate the soil, and the city has gone to great pains over the last 15 years now to try to clean up their act on the streets to make sure all that water gets into the storm system. Don't denude vegetation on a slope without a revegetation plan. If you want to change the vegetation on your slope, get a geologist or engineer along with an urban forester or an arborist to work with you. There are lots of good ways to do this, but you really should have professional help. This is pretty obvious, don't cut into the bottom of a slope. When you do, if you cut into a steep slope at the toe, things may start coming at you. Likewise, you don't put fill at the top of a slope, because that's going to add weight to it. Don't remove stumps from slopes. If you do cut down a tree, you leave that stump there because those roots hang on there for another 5 to 10 years and provide some anchoring for the soil in that immediate neighborhood. Don't install a permanent irrigation system in a landslide-prone area. There's no such thing as a fail-safe irrigation system, like a sprinkler system. You may have to hand water, or if you do put in a sprinkler system, like a drip system or something like that, you do need to deactivate it during the winter. What I thought was, in one case, was a fail-safe system over on one part of the Alki slide ended up being subject to vandalism. And so, as well as it was designed and maintained, you can't foresee all situations. Don't put fill or yard debris on a steep slope. Many people have the habit of taking their yard debris if they live on the edge of a steep slope, and it's out of sight, out of mind, so they put it out there, trees, yard clippings. When that goes, and it will, it's not a matter of if, when it goes, it will not only that mass will go, but it will also it will strip off the topsoil anywhere from a foot to 3 foot thick and carry that down slope with it. So if you need to use that space, you need to build a retaining wall, or better yet, get it to the dump, get it to the transfer station.
Now, what is considered a steep slope?
40% in Seattle, by regulation.
15%.
15% isn't very steep, but the reason is 15% combined with the geologic conditions of wet, in other words springs, along with an area in the right geology, the wrong geology, that being sand over clay or sand over bedrock. When you get those three, that combination of those three, then you're also into, and that's one of the criteria that DPD uses. And for that matter, many, not just Seattle, many of the other jurisdictions, the cities, counties in Western Washington. So the do list, which is kind of the opposite of the don't list, maintain your drainage on your property. You heard about keeping the drains in your neighborhood Clean them up on your own when you see them filling up with leaves. Direct stormwater away from steep slopes and to the extent possible, get it into the storm system. Look at your property. You should know your property better than anyone else. You know where how the trees are leaning going into the winter. Make sure that if you have any drains on that slope, make sure that they're all buttoned up, and that, especially right now, many people, in the past 5 years or so, people put in HDPE pipes, high density polyethylene, and those don't need much in the way of maintenance. But the older pipes, the corrugated pipes that are a little bit on the flimsy side, people have them taped together with duct tape, and they pull apart, they get crushed. Animals do things with them. They need to be checked every year because they may not be working. If you have a wall, make sure the weep holes are not plugged so that the water behind that wall can get out. Again, I just talked about being alert during storms. If there were trees, know where different things are in your slope. So if some of those trees disappear after a big storm, you know that something happened and you can go take a look. Already talked about the irrigation system. Keep the fill off and your yard waste off slopes. Leave those stumps in the ground. If you have any questions, call a professional. And represented by these organizations that are around the room here, and you can get some advice from them today. But if you have something going on your property, get on the phone book, call one of the professionals to help you out. With that, I think we're going to take questions right now.
I'll turn the lights.
So hold on just a second.
Do you want to come up too?
We're going to do a question and answer now. And then after that, then you'll be free to talk to the professionals around the room. Go ahead.
You talked about springs. I live on Queen Anne Hill and there's a lot of springs. What, is that a good thing, the way the water is then flows out, or is that maybe even more prone to landslide?
The question is whether having springs in your property is a good thing or bad. It's good that they're flowing. The one thing you don't want to do is do anything to impede that water from getting out. You could get professional help to find out if there's any way you could capture those springs. But the first thing is to make sure you don't put any fill there or allow them to be impeded in any way, because you want to keep that drainage flowing. But if you do have stability problems, you want to consult with a professional to figure out how to capture those, or maybe capture that water deeper in the hillside.
Next question. Go ahead.
Is there any regulation about blowing your yard waste out into the street and so it goes down to the drains?
Do you have an answer for that? Or maybe Steve does.
It's not, you're not supposed to be putting your leaves into the street. And so I think it's one of those things where actually neighbor to neighbor is maybe the most powerful thing. Because although that's the case, unless somebody complains, it's a little hard for us to do something about it. So no, you're not supposed to be doing it. It's one of those things that's a little hard to control except by education.
If they want to make a complaint though about it, would it be the SBU's number on the back to start with, Laurel? Or
You can try SPU. It's one of those things that's kind of gray between SDOT and SPU, but I would suggest SPU unless Steve, you've got anything other suggestions.
Illegal dumping?
Yeah, it can come to on a lot of different areas. I think in actual fact there is now a law that says you're not supposed to be literally putting your leaves in the street. I think it's more explicit than that. Because it was also a problem downtown. You would see literally downtown Seattle people with blowers doing that. And you don't see that anymore. You see them with their big vacuums, but in more residential areas. So yeah, I would suggest just go ahead and phone Seattle Public Utilities.
Because I remember the illegal dumping is under SPU's
Right, for the solid waste aspect.
But SDOT we have street use, so if anything, you think it's not right in the right of way, street use have people, inspect it, they will check, but it depends on case by case work.
Yeah.
But I think illegal dumping will go SPU.
Go ahead, next.
You know, considering cutting of trees with and without permits, is there a mechanism where, you know, all the tree services, where they know they're not supposed to do that?
We send reminders. The question is, do the tree professionals know that they aren't supposed to take trees off environmental critical area sites, which is the rule, it's the environmental critical area sites.
Yeah.
We send out reminders, but you know, particularly in this economy, you've got all kinds of people looking for work, or maybe they're builders and now they're just tree cutters. They may not be arborists. It's better to get an arborist. They know the rules. The principal rule in the city of Seattle is if it's in one of those mapped areas, the only way that we can approve removal of a tree is if it's considered hazardous by a professional. And that means hazardous to a structure or some area where the folks are. Otherwise, we really cannot approve removing that tree. If it does happen, then we're going to, and we hear about it, we're going to require restoration plans that properly try to seed that hillside again. But we do not have the ability to prove it right now unless it's a hazardous tree. More questions? Maybe we're back there.
When you were talking about the succession of trees on slopes, there's several hillsides on Queen Anne that have a lot of cottonwood. How do they?
They come in, cottonwood comes in where it's wet, and it comes in really quick. And so the thing about cottonwood, we actually keep our eyes out for cottonwood because it has a really nasty habit of dropping large branches in the middle of the summer. And so we keep an eye out for those trees. But cottonwood is more somewhere in the maple, big leaf maple area when it comes in with the alder, but it's on butter sites usually.
So it does hold the slope well?
Yeah, it's actually very fibrous roots, and it sucks up a lot of water, especially during the summer. And that's the reason for that branch drop. It's sucking up so much water. We have an issue that occurs every year after a big rain in the middle of the summer and it gets hot. You'll be hearing the cottonwood branches falling off because they sucked up so much water.
And it's the weight that.
It's the weight.
Okay.
You have a question?
My question is also about cottonwoods. They become hollow,
They will rot very easily. Yeah.
and it seems that, will you need a permit to take those down if they're 85 to 100 feet tall and hollow?
No, well, that's where the issue comes in with the hazard tree. When it's a science, it's called a hazard tree. And so there's two parts to a hazard. First is the potential for failure. So that's what an arborist will do, is just take a look and see what the potential for failure of that tree is. And then the second part about it is that in failing, is it going to strike something of value, i.e. a house or a street or a populated area? If it's not, then it's not a hazard.
Now, is there any compensation to take it down if it's hazardous, or the homeowner has to pay for it?
If it's on Seattle Park's property, we manage it.
But if it's not on, if it's on a homeowner's property?
It's a homeowner's property. If it's on a homeowner's property, then it's their responsibility.
Go ahead, sir.
So just clarifying, on the last slide it said call a professional. So if this involves a private-public relationship, do we still call a professional if we could see some signs happening on the public land? Or?
Well, I would start, the question is if it's a private property next to public property and you see something on the public side and you have a question, should you hire a professional? I would call the public agency first and work with them. It depends on whose property is. If you know which department is responsible for it.
I would assume it's parts, but
You could start with them. Often on some of these hillsides, you got swaths that are utility pieces of property, and then you got parks and you got some SDOT. So it might take a little checking, but I would start with parks and give you call the number.
can we see that on the King County maps? Can you see that? Does it say that there?
I don't think
On
so.
the DPD locator map that you can get access, there's a little toggle on the side where you can put on Parks property.
Okay.
And it'll also pull up the overlay of the parcel aerial photo so you can zoom in on your property that you're concerned about.
Yeah, I would talk to their professionals first before spending any money on your own. Maybe two more questions from the general group. Go ahead, sir.
Is a permit required to prune trees? You mentioned it was required to remove them.
The ECA requirement on trees is normal maintenance is approved and you don't need a permit. And so the question is, are you doing more than that? And that's Mark's an expert for that in terms of just thinning a little bit as opposed to
That's one of the reasons that you bring in an arboriculturist or an arborist. The big issue that you see is especially along our steep slopes, is trees are being topped or have been topped. And basically topping is like taking a hedge trimmer and just shearing off the top of the tree at a number of trees at a set height. There are techniques that arborists use where they can select the branches and they'll give it a good direction. The biggest problem that we see with the trees that we have, and was pointed out with the cottonwood, the alder, and the big leaf maple, is that they decay fairly quickly. And when you top a tree, what happens is, especially in those species, they grow out from that part, and they grow very quickly. They'll accelerate, and they'll put most of their growth into growing past that cut part. What happens is, within 5 to 10 years, as that part decays, and those parts start failing and sliding off the side. And arborists will be able to do some good cutting and reduce that potential for that to happen by making what we call good lateral cuts, and also doing what we call a drop crotch or crown reduction, and by making proper cuts on the tree. That type of work, exceptional work, where you're going to do a lot of reduction, that's actually when Dpd gets stretched in. If you're talking about doing a lot of work, a lot of canopy reduction, anything like over 25% on the tree, then you probably should work with Dpd on revegetation.
I mean, it's obviously a matter of degree, and there can be a gray area in there, because the language, I think, just says normal maintenance and pruning. So that, as opposed to the neighbors saying, hey, they cut the tree half down so they have a view, is kind of what we deal with, is in that range. One more question, maybe over here.
I've been building retaining walls for 20 years in Seattle, and in the DPD recommended drawing of the rockery, which is what I built, there's a perforated pipe that runs behind the wall, generally speaking. And it's kind of a vague area whether it's better to have that pipe or a free draining wall without that pipe that goes through the rocks. And I was curious, the soils conditions that would absolutely determine that you have to have that pipe slope-wise and soils-wise, or when you don't need that pipe in your opinion.
My opinion isn't the one you want. Maybe Susan, do you have an opinion on that, or do we leave it to the drainage folks, who I don't have here?
Well, I think part of it depends on if you're going to put a pipe in, is there a place to take it? Because, you know, the standard detail just shows a pipe behind the wall, but if you don't have a place to leave that drainage, you've concentrated below the pipe, and you don't want it to then just go on the slope below it. So it sort of depends if you have a good place to take the water, depends on the soil conditions that you have. I mean, certainly it makes sense to just put you know, drainage material back there and have things weed out through the face. That's certainly a way to do it as well.
One of the principal rules on handling water on the hillside is do not concentrate the water and send it down to your neighbor. That is one of the things that is forbidden under the code. So you're supposed to try and recreate the natural. And obviously you got different situations for every home, but pulling it together in a pipe and not having a right place for it to go is not a solution that we can support. All right, thanks a lot, you guys. We're going to break now so you can have the one-on-ones. We're filming a little bit of this. When we might ask you a question or two, we're trying to put together a little package that maybe we can use to show other people this information a little more broadly. Thanks again. Thank you.
A little flame torch, and then someplace, but just pulling out the ivy. We actually did a study back in the early 90s, and what we found was that actually pulling the ivy out does most of the damage to it. So if you can get to the roots, you can pull it out, continue to pull it out. It doesn't have a very strong, deeply burrowed root, and so if you get that out, usually it'll go away. It might be a couple of successive parts to do that, but what we found is on steep slopes, if we can roll it back in a big roll, we can usually grub out the small roots that are down in the ground. It'd be pretty effective. The other way you might do it too, is to put fabric over top of it, or some sort of dark fabric. We call it plastic mulch, which is plastic.
Our property used to be one of these kind of wild cherries.
Okay.
And we pulled those out and we've covered our slope with fruit trees now so that we, you know, we still have the roots there. But these little shoots of wild cherry keep coming up. That's just an ongoing battle.
That's just an ongoing battle. And their lifespan in that seed source and its lifespan is about 15 years for that seed source, so it'll continue to pop up. The other problem we run into with some of the cherry is that you may be seeing root suckering, where the roots used to be in the ground from those cherries are just popping up all over the place. And that, the only way you can handle that is grubbing the root out. You could try going to the herbicide usage, but it's going to be a lot of herbicide over a long area. And the other thing is just, just getting down there once a year and pulling them. But that'll take a long time for those roots to go away unless you grub them out. And as they said, grubbing out on a steep slope isn't a good idea.
Thanks for coming. As far as like cottonwoods are concerned, there's some on like the right-of-way that's not on my property. Is there a way that I can tell visually when they're starting to be hazardous?
Well, I would leave that up to an arborist for that. And so if it's on right-of-way, on open right-of-way where there's no road, but it's labeled as right-of-way.
It's like right off the Aurora Bridge,
right.
The south end.
Then what I do is call SDOT because they have arborists as well.
Okay.
And they can take a look at it. If it's right off the Aurora Bridge, potential that it could be SDOT, could be WashDOT, but the idea is that SDOT will usually handle it. We have property there as well in that area. So if you take a look on that map we said referred to, and you can find that particular property, and then if it looks like there's no property name assigned to it or nobody owner, it's just a blank space, that's SDOT.
Okay, but is there any way that I can, like visually to see if I thought it was a problem?
The best thing to do with cottonwood is that it wants to be vertical.
Okay.
Absolutely vertical. If it's not, then that means there's a problem because cottonwood doesn't like to do the bending thing, doesn't like to do the pistol butting, and generally we won't see cottonwood having a problem with cottonwood on steep slopes because it's not normal for them to be covering the steep slope. And the biggest issue I said is that the rotting potential of it at certain parts of it, where parts have broken off of it, it's starting to rot and pieces will fail.
And is the only way you can tell with that is if some of it starts to fall off?
Yeah, and just do a visual inspection.
Because some of them are like 40 years old, and some of the lower and heavier branches.
Right.
In the storms, I just kind of go, ugh.
Well, it's really interesting. They're doing research on hurricanes, and what they found was that where we used to have this idea if you thin out the leaves, that you reduce the wind sail effect, right? Well, what they're finding is that's not true. And what is happening is actually all those branches that are spinning around, they're counterbalancing themselves like a Chinese dish axe. And so the more spinning around that you got that's offsetting each other, the better off the tree is. So as you reduce the amount of branches, all the wind starts hitting those individual branches and starts putting more pressure on the tree. And then the other thing is that individual trees should be left to grow individually. If you have like on a steep slope and you have like say 20 cottonwoods and you take out 15 of them and leave those last 5, now those are going to be more prone to wind throw because they've grown up with the protection of the rest of the trees around them. And so there's generally what you want to do is plan that site so that the trees grow up in the condition that they're going to be in. So if it's exposed, that kind of thing.
And what impact does ivy have on growing up the stumps of like the big maples?
The issue of running into that primarily with the ivy is that it's taking out the lower growing shrub species. It does grow up into the trees and it will eventually compete for resources, i.e. light and water, with the trees. But the other issue is that what we're seeing is that in a lot of places it's increasing the wind sail effect.
Oh, okay.
Because those trees are used to because they're deciduous trees, they're not used to getting hit that hard. And so the other part is they contribute to the increased decay. And so they create holes in the tree and small little holes, and so those continue to create more decay in the tree.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
And sort of have to be aware of what your neighbors are doing. Are they dumping fill in the slope? Is there drainage popping up from uphill, which is something that does happen because people have water problems and then they try to redirect them. So, yeah, it's just a matter of being aware. And also, where is do they have hoses that they've left on and suddenly you're seeing an unusual amount of water. Luckily, people have their hoses on more often in summer, which saturation isn't such a problem because it's just from their drainage. So, no, it sounds like you're in a pretty good situation. Yeah, sure.
I live here.
Okay. Oh, yeah. You live at the bottom of the slope?
Yes.
Or, okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's where the city put a lot of money in.
Yeah.
And my question is, you mentioned adopt a drain.
Right.
Now, I believe the property above us is parkland.
Okay.
So what kind of proactive maintenance does the city do? And if I wanted to adopt a drain, like I could go up there and look at it, because you're spread thin.
Right. So up in this area, and unfortunately the streets don't show in here, but what you could do, and the only advantage of sort of being in the official Adopt a Drain program is that they'll actually come and, like if you collect leaves, they'll actually come away for free and take them away.
See, I didn't live there when this happened.
Okay,
so
right.
I don't know where the storm drain is that affects us.
So I know that up above here, the rainwater is directed away from the slope. Now there's water that simply falls, there's a lot of big open land.
Right.
And so there's going to be water that just directly falls in that slope and could saturate it and could cause a problem. But obviously you want to keep extra water as much as possible. So what you can do is kind of, take a walk, take a drive, and kind of see what's up here, see where the inlets are, and especially in heavy rainstorms or after a big windstorm, just take a walk or drive up there, take something that you could kind of take the leaves away and clear them off.
I've done this a lot.
Oh, okay, great.
But, so the city doesn't buy, what am I trying to say? They don't do it on an annual basis.
Actually, we do.
You do?
We proactively. I mentioned about critical drains.
Yeah.
Okay. Those critical drains before the storm season hits, we go out, we make sure that those catch basins are cleaned out.
Good.
We make sure that the drain is as clear as possible. And then when a big storm is anticipated, more immediate,
sure.
Then we would also try as much as possible to hit the most critical ones.
Right.
Even in the critical drains, there's several hundreds of those.
Oh, I imagine.
So that's why it's an addition to that as much as possible if people can kind of chip in at the moment. The other thing is I mentioned, there's the horizontal drains. We also have a program in terms of periodically checking to make sure that they're draining in the way that they're supposed to. So the city does have an ongoing program. So for every 5 years, we definitely kind of clean out all our drains. Then there's these critical drains in which we try to do it on an annual basis. Okay. So yes, there is a program there.
Good. See, last year we had a little bit of a slide on that. And I called the city and a couple of engineers came out and they looked at it. And even we have trees growing into the pipe that's exposed that the city put from the above. And it's moving it and they looked at it and they said it's fine. There's nothing to be concerned about.
Yeah, most of those, I showed a picture where a big, what they call the HDPE was put down the slope. The way those normally are put in, because of continuing slide action, normally they're laid on the surface, and then we have these huge, pins that go up and over and anchor that pipe to the slope. Actually, usually along the slope.
Not in this case.
So there's no anchors there?
No.
Okay.
No.
And that's the one that's in this parkland that's just kind of right above here. Okay. That's something I can definitely check out. But one of the things that we try to do with those is to make them be able to move a little bit and not fail.
That was explained to me,
yeah. But
we were within the tolerances according to the guy who
okay.
came out.
Yeah.
I was just concerned that now you're mentioning pins to support it, and I don't recall any pins like
It
that.
might be a little, as I said when I say pins, it's more like a, kind of like something that comes over the top and then digs down.
Right, some sort of anchor.
Yeah, but they're pretty, yeah, they're not like big concrete
No,
things or
no,
anything like that.
right.
So anyways, I'll make sure that we check that out. But again, most of those are from, you just visually look and you think, my God, is this really anchored well enough?
I was more concerned about the movement of the tree growing into the pipe.
Into it as being a harming.
Yeah.
Right.
And, I actually thought it was a cast iron pipe or a metal pipe, and it's just plastic.
That's right.
So there is flex built into
It's
it.
special, heavy
Right.
duty.
Yes.
Yeah, right.
All right. Well, do you want my address to look at it or be aware of it, or if you're not?
So it's right above it, I assume, where
Well,
the pipe comes down.
this
Yeah.
it terminates in the back of our building.
Right. Yeah.
The season really start, and what does it actually mean?
Landslide season usually starts here in November. There are only occasionally landslides in November, but it really kicks in December after the groundwater table has had a chance to rise, and the grounds become saturated in November because we get a lot of rain in November, and then once the ground gets saturated and we get additional rainfall in December and January. That's when the landslides really kick off. So our big months for landslides are December, January, and then a little bit into February. Although there was one year, and there have been a few over the years, when it actually continues over into March. But that's a little bit unusual.
Can you talk about the Seattle landslide study and kind of give a basis and foundation of what that was all about?
Yes.
Can you restate that too?
The Seattle landslide study came about because of a white paper done by the mayor's office back in 1997, shortly after all the landslides occurred in January of '97. A task force was created to figure out what to do about landslides, and in that early period of 1997, there were some very contentious meetings. There were 4 very contentious meetings around Seattle, public meetings, and people took a lot of heat, people from the city. And Margaret Pageler was a council member at the time, and she vowed for the city to be proactive. And one of the proactive measures that was recommended by this ad hoc committee was to do a study of the landslide history of Seattle. And Shannon Wilson was selected to do that study. And fortunately, I was very fortunate to be the manager for Shannon Wilson of that study. And in that study, we went into the records of SDOT, which at the time was the Seattle Engineering Department, and we came up with 1,326 landslides, starting back in 1896, all the way up through, at that time, 1997. And we documented all those. We went out and visited them all and looked at their characteristics. And then we published the Seattle Landslide Study in 2000. We also did an update 3 years later in 2003, and we found 100 more. So altogether, there were documented 1,436 landslides.
Can you talk about, based on what you found out there, what were the causes of landslides? If anything. Or are there human factors involved? Is it wet weather?
Yes, both. There was the causes of the landslides were many, but the key ones are water, and then of course human factors. We know that landslides are caused by water, by storms, but also the frequency with which landslides occur, it can be increased by people having messed around with the drainage or grading, or cutting trees, lots of different things, cutting into the toe, putting weight at the top. So all of these things come into play. We found multiple examples of all of those things in those 1,436 landslides.
Now, what has the city really done to kind of protect and really kind of educate the public about landslides? What do you think? Ever since 1996, what's happened since then?
Well, since 1997, and the city has done several things to decrease the frequency of landsliding in Seattle. One is that they've hired geotechnical expertise within the city itself. So SBU, SDOT, Dpd, all of these, the geotechnical staff has been beefed up. They've undertaken the small drainage projects. It's called the spot drainage, where they fixed many landslides throughout a lot of little projects on streets and in neighborhoods where a small amount of money has a big impact. They've also gone to making TV videos of the utilities, the buried utilities of the sewer lines in areas that are landslide prone. And of course, they've also have capital projects, several large $1 million or more projects where they've actually fixed landslide areas. And of course, the subject of this meeting, they've instituted twice a year landslide meetings that have gone on for education of citizens that's gone on for all these years now since then.
If there's one thing that you want to make sure the public walks away with from this meeting, what is it? I mean, is it the do's and don'ts, or I mean, what can homeowners, what do you want them to walk away with from this meeting?
I think if I had one thing to tell people, it would be control your water. Water has so much to do, it's everything to do with landslides. And so if there's anything people should do, it's to be aware of the contribution of water to landslides and how they should keep on top of it and control it.
I don't know. You are likely in advanced outwash. That's a typical geology you see in the West Seattle area. It's advanced outwash, and then you have, you've heard of glacial till, that's on top of it, it's advanced outwash. The layer on top of it. When you say on top, typically how deep? When you say on top, like what, is that inches, is that feet, is that
feet? Meters. Yeah, this is, these are meter scale deposits, 100 feet thick, depending on where you are. But the landslide prone areas in the West Seattle region are mostly associated with advanced outwash on top of impermeable clay. And you can see this blue, this teal colored unit here, and then right at the edge of the bluffs, right below this advanced outwash, are some sediments called QVLC. It's basically lotten clay. It's exactly what you were shown during the presentation, where you have permeable sand over impermeable silts and clays. You've got groundwater penetrating through and sitting on top of that clay layer and causing that slide, making that a plane of weakness. But where you're living, it's really not, that's not the scenario.
I think I'm right on this border, right there. Because I noticed there's one type of soil on the property almost extends that way. So it's like on one side there's almost like, it seems kind of like clay on the top, like sort of clay. But when I dug into it to build a small retaining wall, about a few feet down, it was hard as can be, like rounded pebbles, definitely glacial.
That's
drainage,
likely Vashon soil,
yeah.
what you were saying. Are there any slides in your area?
I'm checking the thing, I didn't
observation in the neighborhood?
Erosion. I think erosion. Just on my own property, I see evidence of kind of a slow erosion.
Graveling of soil off the slope.
Yeah, and like he was saying, no real old deep-rooted trees on that slope. It's all these little young things.
Oh, it's all
Well, some of it I think has been planted because that whole area used to be an orchard. But old cherry trees, like 100-year-old, like old suckers, that are just on their last legs. But
having young alder on a slope is always indicative that the slope failed. It could have been cleared, and then the alder took over. But typically with alder covered slope, you have failures, a bunch of new soil exposed and new.
And if anybody let anything grow up too tall, it takes away the western view of the mountains. So I think it's just been cleared over and over.
Could be the scenario.
But yeah, it's just been a gentle erosion, and my retaining wall. I mean, it could fail at some point, but we'll just have to see. I know it's built properly.
Who did you have build the?
But he had made a lot of it. Ken used to work, so I dug into it, just making sure that it was made. Just being arbitrary, but I haven't seen Because the thing I'm most worried about is any freezing that happens behind the wall. I mean, it's weird is now that I have a slow property, I understand. I don't know. I don't know.
My name's Susan Chang, and I supervise the geotechnical engineering group at DPD.
Okay. When I ask you the questions, can you restate the question?
Sure.
Okay. So basically, can you explain the environmental critical areas and kind of what requires a permit?
Okay. So you're asking what the environmentally critical areas ordinance is and what requires a permit. It's actually a really complicated question and a very long answer, but I'll see if I can give you something short. And basically in terms of ECA areas in the city of Seattle, for landslide prone areas, we're talking about areas of very steep slopes, so areas of 40% and greater, and areas that are prone to landsliding, such as those where we have had slides in the past, and areas where we have the geologic conditions that are right for sliding, and those are all mapped. And so if your property is in one of those areas, you have to be very careful about what you develop in those areas. In fact, there's a restriction on any development in those environmentally critical areas, except for a very narrow set of exemptions, and I think that's probably too much detail to go into here. But almost any sort of work that you want to do in an ECA landslide-prone area requires a permit. And many people are under the erroneous impression that if their retaining walls are under 4 feet high, they think that they don't need a permit. That may be true in the flatter areas, but in the ECA landslide-prone areas, that is not true. For retaining walls of any height, you need a permit.
Can you explain kind of what are the causes of landslides?
There are a number of causes of landslides in the Seattle area. It's really a combination of the geology that we have here, how steep the slopes are, and then really that human influence. And in terms of human influence, the primary cause is mismanagement of stormwater. The number of slides that DPD has to respond to each winter, there's so many cases of going to a slide and at the top of the slope or mid-slope, you'll see that black corrugated pipe that has collected stormwater from the property, and of course you have the sliding right below it. So managing that stormwater is extremely important. And then we've also, people sometimes don't realize that making a small cut at the toe of the slope, or placing fill, or building a wall at the top of the slope, unless those are properly engineered, those kinds of actions can cause slides as well.
I understand that we're in landslide season right now.
Yes.
What does that actually mean?
Well, It means that most of the slides that happen during the rainy time of year in Seattle. That tends to be from about the end of October to the beginning of April. So you can expect to see more sliding during that time. It does take time for the water to build up to really saturate the soils. So we do have some slides earlier on in the season, but they start in earnest in about December, January.
How many people are affected in Seattle? What does that actually mean?
How many people are affected by the environmentally critical areas, the ECA landslide prone? There are about 20,000 properties in the city of Seattle that are designated as ECA landslide prone, and most of those do happen to be residential properties.
So what should those residential properties, those homeowners, what should they do to kind of protect themselves and their properties from landslides?
So to protect properties from landslide, there are really a number of things you can do, but I would say the most important ones would be to make sure that your drainage is routed properly, that you don't have downspouts or pipes that just lead to a steep slope or a landslide-prone area. Make sure that you leave that area alone as much as possible. You ought to inspect those areas to make sure that you don't see cracks in the ground. Keep track of how much the trees are leaning, if they are leaning at all. It would be really important to make sure that the catch basins along your street are clean. And a really good idea to not install irrigation systems in those areas, or if you do have irrigation systems, to make sure that those are turned off during the wet season.
Is there one thing that the public should walk away with? I mean, what's the one thing that they should walk away with from this meeting?
What should the public walk away with from this meeting? I think that would be that if you live in a landslide-prone area, you really do have to be vigilant about your property. You have to take the time to inspect it, get to know it, make sure you know what's happening with your drainage, and just be careful about how you develop it and how you make changes to that slope, if at all.
Thanks, Susan. The significance of these areas?
Sure. Okay, this is a map of landslide-prone areas in the city of Seattle, and you can see two different colors on here. The red zone represents environmentally critical areas for steep slope, and those are areas where the slope is greater than 40%. And what that means is a 10-foot rise over a 25-foot horizontal distance. So steep, that's steep or more so. The blue areas are the potential slide areas, and that's made up of two different kinds of areas. Those are areas where we know we have slides in the past, and in fact the city's records go back to 1896 for recorded slides. So we have these known slide areas, and we have areas where we know that the geology is conducive to sliding. So those together make up these potential slide areas.
Thanks, Susan. Pretty much after this week, I'm going to make a talk about so just run the audio to run my presentation.
Oh, perfect.
And then after what I'm doing is...
Why don't you come around here and see where you are? Oh, sure.
They know.
Okay.
A lot better.
You probably need to flip over some new pages there.
I'm glad you did.
So, Susan, I have a question. I have a
That's